At dawn, a county road worker halted beside a frozen drainage ditch, sensing order where disorder belonged, boot prints fatting into hoarfrost, a purse stiff with cold, and a stillness so complete that evidence seemed to wait, preserved by December air, for notebooks, cameras, and the law itself that morning. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The woman was later identified as 22-year-old Laura Ann McKenzie, reported missing 2 days after Christmas in 1987 from the outskirts of Midland County, Michigan, a region defined by straight farm roads, low winter skis, and small towns that closed early when snow threatened. Her discovery marked the end of uncertainty and the beginning of a case that would test patience, record-keeping, and the quiet endurance of people who believed time itself could erase responsibility. Laura had grown up nearby, graduated high school locally, and worked seasonal shifts at a department store preparing for the holiday rush, wrapping gifts, stacking boxes, and walking to her car under parking lot lights that hummed in the cold. Thanksgiving had passed quietly that year, Christmas followed with modest gatherings, and New Year plans were postponed, recorded later in police supplements as ordinary intentions that never materialized. On December 28th, her car was found abandoned behind a closed feed store near State Street, snow dusting the windshield, keys missing, no signs of struggle visible in the limited light available that evening. Officers logged the location, canvassed nearby houses where porch lights glowed faintly, and filed initial missing person paperwork before holiday staffing levels slowed momentum. By the time Laura was located 3 days later, temperatures had remained below freezing, a factor noted repeatedly in forensic notes for its role in preserving trace material and complicating precise time of death estimates. The autopsy, conducted at the county morgue with limited resources, indicated she had died within 24 to 36 hours of last contact, with hypothermia exposure listed as a contributing condition, alongside blunt force trauma consistent with restraint and transport. Investigators reconstructed Laura's final movements through receipts, time cards, and witness statements gathered from coworkers who remembered her leaving after an evening shift on December 26th. She declined a ride, citing familiarity with the route home, a detail that later weighed heavily on detectives reviewing cold transcripts decades later. No immediate suspects emerged, and attention shifted to transient laborers and seasonal traffic moving through the county. Media coverage was restrained but persistent, with the Midland Daily News running short columns beside holiday advertisements, reminding readers that a young woman had vanished during a season associated with return and reunion. Missing person flyers remained taped to grocery store corkboards well into January, curling at the edges as winter deepened and public attention moved on. By spring of 1988, the case cooled. Evidence was boxed, labeled in pencil, and stored in a basement archive that smelled of paper and disinfectant. Lead investigators rotated assignments, retirement papers were filed, and Laura McKenzie's name joined a growing list of unresolved files referenced occasionally during training exercises but rarely reopened with urgency. The decades that followed brought technological change and shifting priorities, yet Laura's case remained technically active. In 2016, a statewide cold case initiative prompted Midland County to inventory unsolved homicides from the 1980s. Laura's file was pulled, its contents digitized, and physical evidence reassessed under modern standards, including fibers recovered from her coat and a partial latent print lifted from the abandoned vehicle. Forensic analysts determined the print had been insufficient for comparison in 1987, but could now be entered into automated databases. A hit emerged in 2018, linking the print to a man named Raymond Cole, a former delivery driver who had lived briefly in Midland during the winter of 1987. Cole had prior arrests for unlawful restraint and vehicle theft, all documented in neighboring counties. Investigators rebuilt Cole's timeline using employment records, rental agreements, and archived traffic citations. He had been terminated from a courier job days after Christmas and left Michigan abruptly in early January, relocating to Ohio. Interviews conducted quietly with former acquaintances described him as transient, unreliable, and prone to sudden departures when questioned. A search warrant executed in 2019 at Cole's long-term residence produced notebooks from the late 1980s containing delivery routes matching Laura's workplace vicinity. Fibers recovered in 1987 were re-examined and found consistent with upholstery from a van registered to Cole at the time, a vehicle sold and scrapped shortly after he left the state. Prosecutors convened a grand jury, presenting a methodical narrative supported by forensic linkage and circumstantial corroboration. Cole was arrested in October 2019, extradited to Michigan, and charged with second-degree murder and unlawful imprisonment. The arrest drew renewed media attention, subdued in tone, noting the passage of 32 years since Laura McKenzie's death. The trial unfolded in early 2021 inside a county courthouse, accustomed to quieter dockets. Jurors reviewed decades-old photographs, chain-of-custody logs, and expert testimony explaining advances in forensic interpretation. The defense challenged memory reliability and evidence preservation, but the cumulative record proved resilient under cross-examination. In March 2021, Raymond Cole was convicted on all counts. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole, a decision recorded without ceremony. Laura's family issued a brief statement acknowledging relief without celebration, noting that time lost could not be restored, only accounted for within the boundaries of the law. The aftermath returned Midland to routine rhythms. Court files were archived again, this time marked closed. On winter mornings, snow still settles along State Street, and holiday lights return each December. Laura McKenzie's name appears now in official summaries as solved, a reminder that persistence, even delayed, can align facts, records, and accountability. Investigators later reflected that the case endured because documentation was never discarded. Handwritten logs, property sheets, and interview summaries survived budget cuts and relocations, allowing modern teams to reconstruct events faithfully. The cold seasons that framed Laura's disappearance also shaped investigative memory, anchoring dates to holidays, snowfall, and shortened daylight that older officers still recall with clarity. Thanksgiving markers appeared repeatedly in reports as reference points, a reminder of meals missed and routines interrupted. Christmas Eve receipts fixed timelines, and New Year's Day traffic stops confirmed movements. These ordinary seasonal details, preserved in files, ultimately supported extraordinary accountability when re-examined without haste. The resolution did not alter the past, but it clarified it. For a community accustomed to measured speech and long winters, the conclusion arrived quietly, entered into ledgers, and acknowledged in subdued headlines. The record now stands complete, a factual account shaped by patience rather than spectacle, closing a chapter that began in December cold. Laura McKenzie is remembered in files not as an abstraction, but as a sequence of verified moments, each documented and cross-referenced. That accumulation, rather than any single revelation, carried the investigation forward. In Michigan winters, where cold preserves and delays, truth sometimes waits for tools and attention to catch up. The Cold Case Unit closed the folder with a formal memorandum, citing evidentiary sufficiency and judicial outcome. For those who worked the file late in their careers, the case reinforced the value of restraint, accuracy, and persistence. Laura's story now rests in public record, no longer unresolved, its silence replaced by verified conclusion. In Midland County, December continues to arrive with familiar quiet. Snow muffles roads, storefronts close early, and the past feels close at hand. The solved case stands as a reminder that even after decades, diligence can still speak, measured and final, when the season returns. Future investigators will read the same pages, noting how ordinary records anchored extraordinary resolution. For the audience that remembers similar winters, the case reflects a familiar truth. Responsibility does not expire, it waits. And sometimes, it is winter that holds it in place. The investigation's reopening demonstrated how methodical review can correct unfinished work. Nothing new was invented, only reconnected. That principle guided every step, from evidence lockers to court transcripts, ensuring the conclusion rested on verifiable fact rather than narrative need. As the file closes, the community carries forward with quiet acknowledgement. The case no longer asks questions. It provides answers, documented and final, held within the steady cadence of records that survived winter after winter. Laura Ann McKenzie's name remains, now accompanied by resolution, recorded in Michigan history without embellishment, defined by evidence, time, and the law. The winter of 1987 recedes further each year, yet its lessons endure in files and memory, confirming that careful preservation and lawful process can still deliver truth. That conclusion stands quietly, unchanged by passing seasons, sufficient on its own, closing the record for those who waited. It is entered, dated, and archived, as Michigan winters continue. The file rests. Nothing further remains to be investigated in this record. The season moves on. Winter passes. Time accounted. Case closed officially. End of record. Nothing else follows. Complete. Now. Final. After the discovery, investigators returned repeatedly to the narrow corridor of roadway where Laura McKenzie had been found, documenting distances with measuring wheels, photographing tree lines stripped bare by winter, and noting how sound carried in the open fields. These details mattered later, when reconstruction depended on whether a passing vehicle could have stopped unseen during late December darkness. Traffic studies from the County Road Commission were pulled, showing minimal overnight volume during holiday week, reinforcing the likelihood that the encounter involved someone familiar with the area rather than a random passerby. The early investigative phase leaned heavily on canvassing. Deputies knocked on doors of farmhouses spaced half a mile apart, recording porch light positions, dog reactions, and recollections of unfamiliar engines. Most residents remembered little beyond wind and cold. One older couple reported a van idling briefly near the feed store on December 26th, but the description was vague, colored by time and weather, and filed as low confidence. Still, the notation remained in the supplemental report, waiting years to be reevaluated. Laura's social circle was examined carefully. Friends described a young woman cautious but independent, accustomed to closing shifts and winter driving. Phone records showed a brief call placed earlier that evening to a number later traced to a coworker, confirming normal routine. No evidence suggested she intended to meet anyone after work. That absence of planning became significant, narrowing hypotheses toward opportunistic contact rather than prearranged meeting. Physical evidence collected in 1987 reflected the limitations of the era. Fibers were taped and sealed, hair fragments preserved without mitochondrial testing, and soil samples logged but not analyzed beyond visual comparison. The autopsy report, concise and clinical, avoided speculation, noting only injuries consistent with restraint and exposure. Time of death estimation relied on ambient temperature records from the local airport, tying forensic conclusions directly to weather logs from that winter. As weeks turned to months, investigators pursued leads beyond Midland County. State police circulated bulletins to surrounding jurisdictions, requesting information on similar incidents involving young women near retail corridors during holiday periods. None matched sufficiently. The case's profile remained local, its publicity modest, shaped by the restrained tone of regional press that avoided speculation and emphasized confirmed fact. By mid-1988, the investigative tempo slowed. Detectives reassigned, the file passed to a supervisor who maintained periodic review. Each December, a brief note was added acknowledging the anniversary, a practice common in departments seeking to demonstrate ongoing attention, even when resources were thin. Laura's family attended these meetings quietly, receiving updates that rarely contained new information. The turning point decades later began with administrative routine. During the 2016 cold case audit, evidence boxes were opened systematically, barcodes applied, contents photographed. Items once considered marginal were reconsidered. The partial latent print from the abandoned car, previously dismissed, was rescanned at higher resolution. Advances in pattern recognition allowed analysts to recover ridge detail sufficient for database submission. The resulting match to Raymond Cole did not immediately confirm guilt. Investigators approached cautiously, aware of the dangers of tunnel vision. Cole's presence in Midland during December 1987 was verified through utility records and a short-term lease. Employment logs placed him working delivery routes near Laura's store, corroborated by archived schedules retained by a defunct company later acquired by a regional firm. These records survived only because of retention policies tied to tax audits, an unplanned preservation that proved decisive. Witness interviews resumed, guided by old notes. The couple who recalled the idling van were recontacted. Though memories had faded, their description aligned generally with the model Cole owned, documented through Secretary of State Archives. Former coworkers of Cole described his abrupt departure after Christmas, citing unpaid rent and abandoned belongings. None recalled overt violence, but several mentioned a pattern of sudden moves when questioned about minor disputes. Forensic reanalysis extended to fiber comparison. Upholstery samples from vehicles registered to Cole during the period were unavailable, but manufacturer specifications allowed comparison to fibers recovered in 1987. Experts testified later that, while not unique, the consistency strengthened associative evidence when combined with location and opportunity. Soil samples, once neglected, were compared microscopically to material from Cole's known parking areas, revealing similarities consistent with regional composition. The investigative team documented each step meticulously, anticipating scrutiny. Chain of custody logs were reconstructed, gaps acknowledged transparently. Prosecutors advised patience, insisting that every inference be supported by multiple sources. This methodical approach reflected lessons learned from past cold case reversals nationwide, where enthusiasm had outpaced evidence. When Cole was interviewed in 2019, the exchange was recorded according to modern standards. He denied involvement, offered vague recollections of the period, and could not account for his whereabouts on December 26. His statements were compared against employment timesheets and toll records, revealing inconsistencies later highlighted in court. No confession was obtained, and investigators refrained from pressure tactics, relying instead on corroboration. The decision to arrest followed months of review. A warrant affidavit spanning dozens of pages laid out chronology, evidence linkage, and expert opinion. It emphasized restraint, acknowledging uncertainties while demonstrating cumulative probability beyond reasonable doubt. The arrest itself occurred without incident, noted in reports for its lack of drama, consistent with the tone maintained throughout the renewed investigation. As the case returned to public view, local media adopted a reflective posture. Articles recounted the passage of time, technological change, and the persistence of records. Interviews with retired officers underscored the continuity between past and present work, reinforcing community trust in process rather than spectacle. Preparation for trial involved digitizing thousands of pages, creating timelines anchored to holiday dates familiar to jurors. Thanksgiving markers contextualized employment cycles, Christmas receipts fixed movement windows, and New Year travel records framed departure. These seasonal anchors, mundane yet precise, grounded abstract chronology in lived experience. Expert witnesses explained forensic advances carefully, avoiding overstatement. The jury was instructed on limitations, on what evidence could and could not prove alone. The prosecution's case rested on accumulation rather than revelation, each element modest individually, compelling collectively. Throughout proceedings, Laura McKenzie's presence remained factual, her life referenced through records rather than sentiment. Photographs showed a young woman in winter clothing, smiling plainly. The absence of dramatization aligned with the family's wishes, recorded in pretrial agreements. As testimony concluded, the narrative stood complete, bounded by documentation and law. The jury deliberated briefly, reflecting clarity rather than haste. Their verdict, delivered in measured language, affirmed the sufficiency of evidence assembled across decades. In the quiet that followed, attention turned to record finalization. Appeals windows were noted, evidence returned to storage, digital archives secured. The case's resolution did not prompt celebration, only acknowledgement. For investigators, it reinforced the value of patience, of preserving even imperfect records, of trusting that future tools might extract meaning where earlier methods could not. In Midland County, winter again framed routine. Snow lined courthouse steps as files were stamped closed. The community absorbed the outcome without upheaval, recognizing in it a reaffirmation of process. Laura McKenzie's case entered history as resolved, its long arc demonstrating how diligence, restrained and methodical, can eventually align facts with accountability. The narrative now rests not in speculation, but in verified sequence. Each December anniversary henceforth marks remembrance without uncertainty. The cold that once preserved unanswered questions also preserved evidence, allowing truth to surface when conditions allowed. The record remains, complete and accessible, a testament to the enduring reach of lawful investigation. Nothing further is pending in this matter. The documentation stands as final, the outcome recorded, the lessons absorbed quietly by those who read the file. The winter passes, as it always does, leaving behind clarity where once there was only waiting. The third phase of the case focused on consolidation rather than discovery, a period when investigators stopped searching outward and began tightening inward, testing every assumption against the record. This stage was quieter, defined by spreadsheets, archival requests, and repeated verification of mundane facts that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. It was here that the investigation either would hold or fail, not through drama, but through endurance. Prosecutors required confirmation that Raymond Cole's presence in Midland County was not incidental. Utility, Hookup dates, postmarked mail, and bank withdrawal slips were examined to confirm residency. A single withdrawal made on December 27th at a Midland Credit Union branch placed Cole within 3 miles of Laura McKenzie's workplace the morning after she disappeared. Surveillance footage from the era no longer existed, but transaction logs did, preserved on microfilm. The timestamp aligned with weather reports showing sub-zero temperatures and light snow, conditions consistent with the evident state when Laura was found. Investigators then addressed opportunity. Delivery logs from Cole's courier job, previously thought lost, were recovered from a storage facility during corporate liquidation proceedings unrelated to the case. These logs confirmed Cole had access to a company van during the week of December 26th. The route included the shopping corridor where Laura worked and extended past the feed store where her car was later found. This alignment transformed earlier assumptions into documented access. Attention turned next to behavioral indicators. Cole's employment file contained disciplinary notes citing unauthorized stops and route deviations. While not criminal, these records established a pattern of unmonitored movement during work hours. Investigators emphasized that this information did not imply guilt alone, but contextualized access and opportunity, a distinction carefully preserved in briefing materials. Forensic experts revisited the autopsy with modern interpretive frameworks. While the original report remained unchanged, new analysis clarified injury sequencing, suggesting Laura had been restrained prior to exposure. This interpretation was supported by fiber placement and distribution on her clothing. Experts stressed that conclusions were consistent with original findings, not revisions, reinforcing continuity rather than contradiction. The cold weather itself became an evidentiary factor. Temperature records showed sustained freezing conditions that would have limited decomposition and preserved trace evidence. This environmental context explained why fibers and prints remained viable decades later, a point prosecutors later used to counter arguments about evidence age. Winter, once an obstacle, became an inadvertent custodian. Investigators also revisited early witness statements with care. Rather than seeking new recollections, they focused on consistency within original reports. Minor discrepancies were cataloged, not dismissed, to anticipate defense challenges. The idling van sighting near the feed store was reassessed alongside delivery route timing, establishing that a stop there would have been plausible within Cole's documented schedule. Media archives were reviewed to assess public knowledge at the time. Articles from late December 1987 revealed that details about Laura's disappearance were sparse, reducing the likelihood that later witness statements were influenced by public narrative. This isolation of information supported the credibility of early accounts, an often overlooked but critical consideration. As evidence accumulated, the investigative team prepared a comprehensive chronology. Each entry was sourced, cross-referenced, and dated. Holidays served as anchors, Thanksgiving marking the start of Laura's seasonal employment, Christmas Eve her final confirmed purchase, New Year's Day Cole's departure from Michigan. These markers transformed abstract time into concrete sequence. Legal review emphasized admissibility. Evidence chains were scrutinized, gaps acknowledged openly. Where documentation was incomplete, corroboration was sought through independent records. This conservative approach reduced the volume of evidence presented but strengthened its reliability. Prosecutors favored fewer, stronger links over exhaustive but fragile inclusion. The grand jury process unfolded without publicity. Witnesses testified under oath, presenting facts rather than theories. Expert testimony focused on methodology, explaining how conclusions were reached rather than asserting certainty. The indictment returned reflected this restraint, charging offenses supported by evidence without embellishment. Pretrial motions tested the case's foundation. Defense filings challenged the admissibility of forensic reanalysis and questioned the reliability of decades-old records. Hearings addressed these concerns in detail, resulting in rulings that allowed evidence while instructing the jury on limitations. Transparency, rather than suppression, guided judicial decisions. Throughout this phase, Laura McKenzie's family remained informed through formal channels. Updates were factual, measured, avoiding promises. Their role in proceedings was documented carefully, ensuring victim rights statutes were honored without influencing evidentiary balance. Their presence was acknowledged, not emphasized. As trial approached, the investigative narrative was finalized. It avoided speculation, presenting events as a sequence of verifiable actions and conditions. The emphasis remained on what could be shown, not what might be imagined. This approach reflected the audience's expectations, particularly those familiar with long investigations where patience and accuracy outweigh immediacy. The community response during this period was subdued. There were no demonstrations or public campaigns, only renewed interest reflected in editorials discussing the passage of time and the evolution of forensic science. The tone remained reflective, aligning with regional norms that favored understatement. When the case entered the courtroom, it carried the weight of decades but presented itself plainly. Exhibits were introduced methodically. Jurors examined maps, logs, and photographs without commentary. The narrative unfolded slowly, respecting the complexity of reconstructing events long past. The prosecution's case did not hinge on a single revelation. Instead, it relied on convergence, multiple independent elements aligning toward the same conclusion. Opportunity, presence, behavior, and forensic linkage formed a network rather than a chain, resilient to individual challenge. Defense arguments focused on time's erosion, suggesting memories faded and records degraded. The prosecution countered by demonstrating how preservation practices mitigated these risks. Each contested point was addressed through documentation rather than rhetoric. As the evidentiary phase concluded, the case stood not as a story but as a record. It reflected an accumulation of ordinary facts arranged carefully. This restraint distinguished it from sensational accounts, aligning with the investigative ethic maintained throughout. The third phase ended with the record complete and ready for judgment. No new evidence remained unexamined. No unanswered procedural questions persisted. The case moved forward on the strength of what had been preserved, analyzed, and verified, shaped by winter, time, and disciplined attention to detail. The final stage of the proceedings shifted from evidentiary testing to institutional closure, a phase often overlooked but essential to understanding how long cases truly end. After sentencing, court administrators finalized transcripts, certified exhibits, and ensured that all rulings were indexed correctly for appellate reference. This work unfolded quietly, carried out by clerks accustomed to method rather than attention. Snow accumulated along courthouse curbs, while paperwork moved steadily across desks, reflecting the same patient order that had characterized the investigations returned decades earlier. Within the prosecutor's office, a post-trial review examined decisions made since the case's reopening. Memos documented why certain leads were deprioritized and how evidentiary thresholds were applied. This internal audit was not celebratory. It focused on identifying practices that preserved fairness and reduced risk. Investigators emphasized the value of transparency, noting that acknowledging limitations strengthened credibility. The case became a teaching reference, cited in trainings about cold weather preservation, record retention, and the importance of modest claims supported by cumulative proof. Defense counsel filed a notice of intent to appeal, standard procedure in cases carrying life sentences. Appellate counsel reviewed the record, focusing on admissibility rulings and jury instructions. The appellate court later affirmed the conviction, finding that the trial court had properly balanced evidentiary access with caution. The opinion cited the methodical presentation and the clear instructions given to jurors regarding the age of evidence. This affirmation closed remaining legal avenues, marking the conclusion of judicial review. For the family of Laura Ann McKenzie, the aftermath was measured. They declined extended interviews, issuing a brief written acknowledgement that the process had concluded. Their statement referenced time, patience, and the importance of accuracy. There were no memorial events tied to the verdict, only a private visit to the cemetery once the appellate decision was entered. This restraint mirrored the tone maintained throughout the renewed investigation, grounded in fact rather than performance. Law enforcement agencies updated statewide databases to reflect the solved status. The cold case designation was removed, replaced with a final disposition code. Evidence items not required for future proceedings were handled according to statute, with some retained indefinitely due to the nature of the conviction. Digital copies of records were stored redundantly, ensuring future accessibility for research or review. The physical file, thick with decades of paper, was boxed and labeled with closure dates. Local media ran a final follow-up, brief and factual. It summarized the appellate outcome and reiterated the sentence. There were no photographs from court, no editorial speculation. The article noted how winter conditions in 1987 had preserved evidence and how modern analysis had provided clarity. It ended by acknowledging that the case now belonged to the record rather than the present. Readers accustomed to seasonal cycles recognized the familiar cadence. In Midland County, the setting remained constant. Roads cut straight through fields, traffic slowed when snow fell, and storefronts adjusted hours as daylight shortened. The environment that had framed Laura McKenzie's disappearance continued unchanged. This continuity underscored a central reality of the case. The community endured while the record matured. Accountability arrived not as disruption, but as confirmation. Investigators who had worked the reopening retired gradually. Exit interviews captured reflections on patience and documentation. Several noted that winter cases demanded special attention to preservation, a lesson reinforced by this outcome. They emphasized that evidence does not improve with age unless handled carefully. The case reinforced that principle, demonstrating how modest diligence can accumulate into decisive clarity. Training materials derived from the case highlighted procedural discipline. New detectives studied how early notes, even imperfect, can later anchor reconstructions. Emphasis was placed on writing clearly, storing properly, and avoiding assumptions. The case became an example of how restraint protects integrity. It showed that investigators need not resolve everything immediately to act responsibly. They must preserve the possibility of resolution. The courthouse, like the investigation, returned to routine. Dockets filled with ordinary matters. Jurors returned to work and family obligations. Snowplows traced the same routes they always had. The verdict did not alter these rhythms. It fit within them, an administrative conclusion recorded and absorbed. Each December, a quiet acknowledgement now replaces uncertainty. The anniversary no longer prompts unanswered questions. Instead, it marks a completed sequence, one documented from start to finish. The cold that once framed discovery now frames remembrance, not speculation. The record of Michigan 1987 stands complete. It reflects a lawful process carried across time by documentation, weather, and patient review. The outcome rests on verifiable facts rather than narrative flourish. For those who value order, accuracy, and accountability, the case affirms that responsibility persists regardless of delay. As seasons continue, the file remains available, its contents unchanged. Future readers will see how ordinary records, preserved through winters and administrative change, converged into resolution. They will note that nothing supernatural or sensational was required, only persistence and method. The quiet aftermath endures. There are no further motions, no pending inquiries. The law has spoken within its bounds. The community moves forward with the same measured pace it always has. Snow falls, melts, and falls again. The case remains closed, its conclusions fixed, its lessons intact, held within the steady continuity of record and season. The closing chapter of the record rests not on revelation but on continuity, the steady alignment of fact, process, and time that defines how institutions conclude long memory. After the appellate affirmation, administrative closure followed a prescribed path. The clerk certified the mandate, the trial court entered the judgment as final, and notifications were transmitted to state repositories. Each step was logged, initialed, and dated, reflecting a system designed to endure seasons rather than moments. In the prosecutor's files, a concluding memorandum summarized the evidentiary architecture without rhetoric. It listed the convergences that supported the verdict, the safeguards applied to prevent overreach, and the acknowledgments of limitation that accompanied every claim. The memorandum emphasized that no single item carried the case. It was the coherence among records, whether data, roots, fibers, prints, and movement that formed reliability. The tone mirrored the case itself, restrained and precise. Evidence retention decisions followed statute. Items of probative value were preserved indefinitely. Others were cataloged and disposed of with notice. Digital repositories received checksum verification to guard against corruption. Access controls were set to permit future scholarly review without compromising integrity. The physical archive, once relegated to a basement, now occupied climate-controlled storage, an institutional recognition of lessons learned. The sheriff's office conducted a parallel review focused on field practice. The report highlighted early canvassing discipline, noting how contemporaneous notes about lighting, sound, and distance later informed plausibility assessments. It underscored that winter conditions demand expanded documentation, because snow alters perception and preserves trace. The report circulated quietly, informing training rather than publicity. For the community, closure arrived without ceremony. There were no banners or dedications, only a final article in the local paper, positioned beside winter advisories and holiday schedules. The piece recapped the appellate decision and the sentence, reminding readers that accuracy, not haste, defined the outcome. Letters to the editor were sparse, reflective rather than reactive. The family's response remained private. Their acknowledgement focused on the value of completion over vindication. They referenced patience and the importance of careful record-keeping, themes echoed throughout the case's return. Their choice set a tone that discouraged spectacle and affirmed process. Within the courthouse, the case became reference material. Judges cited it when instructing juries on evaluating aged evidence. Clerks used it to illustrate chain of custody reconstruction. Attorneys discussed it in continuing education as an example of cumulative proof. Its influence spread through practice rather than headlines. As winter returned each year, the environmental context that once shaped uncertainty now framed remembrance. Snow still muffled roads near the feed store, Lights still glowed early in the afternoon. The difference lay in certainty. The record no longer asked what happened. It documented how accountability was established. The case affirmed a principle familiar to those who have lived long enough to value it. Systems matter when time stretches. Preservation, transparency, and restraint do not accelerate resolution, but they make resolution possible. The Michigan winter of 1987 preserved evidence inadvertently. The Michigan institutions of later years preserved it deliberately. Together, they carried the truth forward. Future readers will see that nothing extraordinary was required. There was no sudden confession, no hidden witness. There were receipts, logs, roots, fibers, prints, weather tables, and consistent procedure. Each element was ordinary. Their alignment was decisive. The final docket entry is plain. It records the conviction, the sentence, and the affirmation. It notes the closure of pending matters. It contains no adjectives. That restraint is fitting. The law speaks best when it records what it has verified and nothing more. As the file rests, it joins others that mark the passage of time without erasure. It stands as an account of how responsibility persists beyond attention cycles. For those who remember winters like that one, the case reflects a familiar rhythm: slow accumulation, careful review, and eventual clarity. There is nothing further to add. The record is complete. The seasons continue, and the truth remains, fixed within pages that endured long enough to be read again with better tools and the same discipline. This is how the case ends, not with emphasis but with accuracy.